colonial botanist, I think, literally would have been like stressed out by fungi. Like, quite a lot of European botanists will have gone on these horrible expeditions across the world to the different colonies, particularly of the British Empire, and kind of been like, what the hell are these fungi? And like, they didn't fit into any of the sort of behaviors that, for example, maybe plants do or animals in other respects do. And therefore, fungi were really kind of denounced as being like a lesser life form, which is kind of, to be honest, how queer people are viewed in a lot of ways, and particularly in the current climate, trans people, because it's like you don't fit, I don't understand you.
In the UK, there has been somewhat of a growing interest in soils, how to repair them, how to reclaim them, and how to forge old and new relationships between humans and their earthy kin. This includes compost clubs, foraging, guerrilla gardening, spore spreading, and even microbe discos and mycelium parties. These activities are creating networks that explore and consider what we can learn about ourselves through getting up close and personal with life underground. At the same time, though, there is a need for awareness and inquiry into the accessibility aspects of these activities and the political underbelly of the topic of reconnecting with nature. The aim of this episode is to ask, why should we care about soil? Why is getting to know plants and fungi a political act? And what can soils teach us about ourselves and the kind of communities we may want to be a part of? I'm excited to be speaking with Maymana Arefin today about interspecies relationships with fungi and the political, artistic and liberatory powers that can be gathered by paying more attention to this very important biological kingdom. So if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself, Maymana, and how you entered this world of fungi and soil.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for having me. So as you said, I'm Maymana. I am a forager and a teacher in many ways. I used to train people to become gardeners. So I kind of had a previous life almost to being a community gardener. And that was before I started to get on this journey of deep diving into soil and particularly fungi. I would say like my entry point was very much like through the plant world, as I think probably quite a lot of fungi enthusiasts do, because in some ways I feel like the plant world we have a lot more connection with in general. It's really interesting to me because we're actually more closely related genetically to fungi than we are to plants. But I feel a lot of people have kind of more kinship with like trees and other plants. Like it's something that really interests me. But my sort of background, as I mentioned, I trained as a community gardener during one of the lockdowns of the pandemic, actually. So it was like a really specific moment. And I had always loved being outdoors, always loved climbing trees, like be that person. Yeah, since I was a kid, just kind of like digging and like looking really closely at worms and just like being a weirdo basically outdoors. Yeah, and was really, really like lucky to have two parents that were also real big lovers of like being in forests, and yeah, just like kind of let me explore a lot when I was little. I also have an older sister who is just 3 years older than me, and we kind of would both just be running around making, twig forts and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I feel like we had a lot of time, the two of us, to kind of just explore for a bit when we were growing up. And then, yeah, I decided to kind of like inadvertently decided to go down this path of training to become a gardener, because I wanted to sort of formalize some of my knowledge that I felt I'd gained through my lived experience of being out and about. And yeah, it was also like a particular moment of the COVID pandemic where obviously there was a lot of fear and like grief in the air. And I feel like there still is in many ways, but it kind of really prompted this shift in me of like, how do I do something that feels more rewarding and allows me to be outdoors with other people, and yeah, kind of like exploring our relationship to the land and improving our health really through doing that. So yeah, it's a very long-winded way of saying I've always been really interested in the natural world and have always felt a lot of kinship. But the particular route that led me to fungi was really, really accidental, or just be completely honest. Like, I was studying to become like a horticulturalist, and then it was the kind of autumn time. And obviously, as most people know, in this part of the world, we have an autumn where all of the plants kind of, well, the majority of plants die back and it's really bare. And I think this was like a real moment of kind of heaviness for me. I've always been someone that's like quite solar charged and like loves being out when it's good weather, which is quite rare. And in autumn, especially. So it was like so dark and, yeah, frankly, quite bleak. And I'd be going on these kind of walks by myself, just trying to revise some of the things that I'd been learning in my horticultural training. And obviously, there wasn't really much to revise from because all the plants had like died back. And yeah, I had to admit, I was in like quite I would say like quite a anxious and quite a depressed state. Generally speaking, I've had quite a lot of, yeah, challenges with my mental health, but this was like a particular moment of like real isolation in the pandemic and just like existential sort of fear and grief and all of those things. So I was going on these walks, not really knowing why or, yeah, what it was going to lead me to. And yeah, then literally started seeing all of these mushrooms that were, I just found so otherworldly. And it really did feel like this kind of Alice in Wonderland situation of being like, what is that? And then being led down like sometimes literal kind of rabbit holes, and other times just getting very close up to the fungi and just wanting to learn more, really. And it sparked a curiosity that's stayed with me ever since. And yeah, I'm just trying my best to kind of continue learning and see what through my learnings I can share with other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. Did you continue with the horticulture?
Yeah, I did. Yeah. I felt like they kind of went hand in hand. And I just felt like the fungi and soil stuff that I was kind of teaching myself on the side, we complemented each other and has led me to have like hopefully a more holistic understanding around like ecosystems, which I kind of feel like most people, if they're learning about plants, should also learn about fungi, but maybe that's my own agenda.
No, I completely down with that. I wonder how would you say your education around fungi and soils has come more informally? And also, I'm curious about the kind of community that you've found through soils and fungi. I mean, you've already spoken about the fungi communities that you've encountered, but I'm also talking about human communities as well.
Totally. I definitely do feel like I found like a lot of communities through being in kind of relationship with fungi and soil. And I guess to build on what I mentioned of like how I came into this sort of journey in the first place, I do really feel like it came from a very sort of emotional, intuitive space of, yeah, it sounds really quite bizarre to people who maybe aren't in the same is, and it might sound quite like hippie sort of, but I really did feel like I was in quite a lonely space, and these sort of cheerful characters of the fungi just kind of like emerged at exactly the sort of moment that I really needed some like something to make me smile, essentially. So that in itself feels like a very sort of important emotional relationship and something that I kind of repeatedly have come back to in terms of feeling a real sense of like being drawn into the world of fungi. And when I feel a little bit disconnected for a bit and maybe just go on a walk, not expecting to see anything, every single time without fail, that's been when I've like found a mushroom that I have never met before, or something like, yeah, spectacular has kind of like appeared. And it does really feel like this kind of, yeah, this community that has kind of opened itself up to me, which I feel really grateful for. There was a first part of that question that I've slightly forgotten. Do you mind just repeating it?
Yeah, sure. It was about whether you feel that your education around and knowledge around fungi has come formally or more informally.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel like around fungi, it's definitely been more informal. And I think that's why sometimes I still find it hard to like identify as like a mycologist, or when I do, then I usually say an amateur mycologist because I haven't trained formally in kind of fungal identification and that kind of thing. But what I find really interesting is that, like, within the fungi community of humans, most people who are so knowledgeable and like experienced in terms of, yeah, the mushroom world and kind of knowing how to recognize different mushrooms and their habitats and smells and all of the sensory stuff that comes with that. Most of them are not really trained as such. And I think like there's a lot of reasons for why that is. And maybe one of them is because fungi as a whole are kind of quite have been historically really overlooked in terms of the natural world. And it kind of goes back to like a really long time ago, like really since sort of Victorian times, like the fungi used to be categorized as like a lesser plant. And I think for a long time, sort of the colonial botanists would have just been like, well, that's something that does something a bit weird and we don't really know about that. So let's just put that over there. Um, and it's led to a lot of kind of mycophobia, fear, and sort of a lot of people like turning up their noses at the wild of fungi, which unfortunately has meant that there's not been like a lot of resources available for people to really study and learn about fungi, even if there is like a definite demand and like appetite for that, which I'm obviously really like grateful to see has happened, especially in the last like decade. So yeah, it's definitely been a pretty self-taught journey for me. The soil stuff, I have to admit, I've learned a lot more formally about soil science, and that kind of came along with my horticultural training. And yeah, the importance of recognizing that soil is literally like where it all starts. And if we don't take care of the soil, we're not going to be able to have plants. We're not going to be able to have us. So like, um, yeah, I have studied the kind of more soil science aspect more formally, but the fungi stuff, yeah, has all just been my own sort of passion project, which has now kind of become this like fairly good knowledge, which I'm really, yeah, grateful for.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as you said, about perhaps maybe the sensory aspects of understanding, not just fungi, but also plants as well, is definitely something that's maybe more pushed into sort of social sciences. And yeah, like there's not that much space, I wouldn't say, like in the natural scientific areas of research, being receptive to that angle of studying and examining ecologies and ecosystems. And I guess that's the importance of kind of combining the two and trying to revolutionize how we actually understand the living world. And I also was curious about how you then went from this kind of curiosity to then formalizing this into your project Fungi Futures. Maybe if you want to talk a little bit about that and the kinds of people you interact with and get involved in your project.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I just before I outline that, I really hear what you said about the sort of the scientific. There isn't usually much space for sort of the emotional sensory side of things in scientific spaces. And it's interesting because yeah, that's something I think about a lot, because I actually again, a kind of previous life, I trained as a natural scientist, and particularly like was really interested in neuroscience and psychology, and then went on to do my master's, which was more around kind of analyzing the role of science and technology in society. And I think the reason I mention all of this is just because I think what the master's allowed me to explore a lot is that when people are really passionate about what they're studying and learning about, then that naturally creates like better, more thorough, more socially engaged like knowledge. And I feel like it's a very sort of Western tradition to try and separate knowledge, the sort of cognitive stuff, from spiritual, emotional. And I guess like that's a binary that I really try and resist, even though I think a lot of people, because most of the work that I do now is more kind of artistic and embodied, really, I think, yeah, it's sometimes causes people to think that the scientific aspect isn't there, when actually I really, really kind of strongly believe that both things like need to exist at the same time. Like you can be really rigorous as a scientist, but also really care about fungi and their conservation and all of this stuff. So yeah, I really hear what you said with that. And it kind of leads me on to why I set up Fungi Futures, because it came out of my dissertation that I was writing for my master's, which thankfully my supervisor was and my department was like really supportive of this, but it did end up just being a dissertation completely about fungi, which was not really spelled out in terms of like what the master's was supposed to be about. But I was looking at the sort of mycelium networks of mycorrhizal fungi, which are fungi that connect with plant roots. So myco just means fungi and rhiza means root. So it's literally, those the types of fungi that plants and connect with and form symbiotic relationships with. And I was looking at these mycelium networks, which are sometimes called the wood wide web, and thinking about how essentially analyzing like how those networks can teach us about ourselves as humans and kind of interconnection and the importance of resource redistribution and caring for people when there's need, essentially. So whether that's like disabled folks, chronically ill people, a big sort of disability justice angle and sort of practice was like important in my dissertation, to think around like, why is care so important and how is care work so often invisibilized, which is essentially what happens to fungi. They are doing all of this really, really essential work in the soil, and we've known about it, not in a huge amount of detail for a long time, but we have known that they're there doing something really important, and no one's really given them much attention or like gratitude. So yeah, just kind of like visibilizing those relationships between care and the fungi world. And I set up this project, Fungi Futures, off the back of my research. And yeah, it's grown tremendously since. It's been such an amazing thing to witness, other people being really interested and willing to kind of open themselves up to learning what fungi can teach us, because yeah, I definitely don't claim to have all the answers. I'm still very much learning myself in terms of what they can teach us, and I'm constantly trying to remember that I'm not just I mean, I don't hold all of the knowledge by any means. Like, I'm also just trying to create those spaces where we can learn together and try and build those relationships that sometimes we just don't have.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. I think it's super important. I will try and include as many links as I can to your work with Fungi Futures and your Instagram page, which I find extremely inspiring and exciting. It's so artistic and beautiful how you communicate your work through your Instagram. And I wondered if maybe you'd like to talk a bit about some of the inspirations or teachers that you learn from and develop your knowledge from, because sometimes for me that's one of those interesting things when I talk to people through this podcast, is learning who they've got their knowledge from and who they've been impacted by and moved by and these kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good question. I feel like, truthfully, with fungi, because it has been so much, I was going to say so self-taught, but the funny thing is, like, it's not really self-taught because the fungi are the ones that are teaching me. So it's not, again, that's quite a like human-centric framing of that. But generally speaking, most of the knowledge I've had has just been like myself in relationship with the fungi. But having said that, I do really feel, particularly in this current moment, there's a lot of learning that's come for me from people who are currently living on occupied land, because I think the relationships, for example, of Palestinian land workers or of Sudanese or Congolese people or indigenous people in the Amazon or to Turtle Island, like there's so many different places where land has been, or in Kashmir, for example, just so many places where there's like occupied land that people have really kind of gone so beyond their own sort of levels of safety and comfort, essentially, to protect the land around them. And I feel like that's something that I constantly am trying to really remember, the immense amount of privilege I have to be able to be in relationship with land so easily. And yeah, essentially like what cost that comes at for other people, for me to be able to have such a comfortable relationship and that sort of level of privilege in the UK, and simultaneously the UK being the reason in many cases for conflicts in so many lands abroad, particularly the genocide in Palestine. So I think that's when it comes to teachings, even if I don't have personal relationships with a lot of people directly across the world, I take a huge amount of inspiration and also hold a huge amount of gratitude and respect for people who are going to such enormous lengths to protect the natural world, and and are often faced with such violence as a result of that kind of that relationship and that sort of commitment. So yeah, it's a hard one. I think a lot of the time in sort of natural world, well, not the natural world, the horticulture sort of sector or environmental sector, I feel like, especially in the UK, it's very white and also very kind of like depoliticized. And I think that's why, for that question, as much as fungi are my sort of original teachers, the humans that I kind of want to give the most credit in this situation are people who are doing that real work and putting themselves at immense risk, which I know I'm not realistically. Like, it's much easier for me to say that I am trying to teach people about fungi and plants, whereas like someone who is not allowed to forage on the backyard because of occupation, it's a completely different story. So that's kind of where I'm at with the teaching element.
Yeah, thank you. There is a really good documentary, several documentaries, and one I've completely forgotten the name of it now.
The Foragers by
That's it. Yeah. It's that one.
Yeah, that documentary is beautiful. But
yeah, I'd love to share that actually in the show notes of this podcast, because I think it really encapsulates a bit of what you were describing just now.
Yeah, totally.
Well, thank you so much for putting those things into perspective. And I also feel like, again, going back to your Instagram page as well, the way that you have an amazing ability to hold fungi up almost as a mirror to society, kind of to highlight the changeability and the transient nature of some of the most harmful social constructs that we have normalized in society today, that influence culture, power, systems of oppression. And you had a video installation at Kew Gardens titled Queer Nature. I can't remember exactly when it was.
It was good weather, so I feel like it was it was in autumn last year.
Maybe you could talk us through what is queer ecology and some examples of how fungi defy binaries.
That's such a great question. So I feel like queer ecologies, it's interesting because it's like a phrase that people really understand quite differently. I've realized from being in quite a lot of like talks and panels and stuff around that topic. But I guess to me, when you queer something, it's actually like a verb rather than, I think sometimes there's quite a literal understanding of like queer means that you are not heterosexual, or you are like a specific reading of sexuality and gender. Whereas for me, queering is like a political action and a verb. So it's very much around how can we like subvert the binaries that exist in the world. And when that is in the context of ecology, then it's really interesting because I mean, all of these are just words and constructs really, but ecology, I guess, captures how we understand the relationships in the natural world. So because the natural world for so long and ecology has been sort of explored in a very binary but also very colonial way of kind of categorizing and deciding that because flower has two parts, one of them which produces seeds and one of them produces pollen, then one of them must be male and one of them must be female, and kind of making these parallels between ourselves as humans and many other kind of life forms in the natural world. So I guess to queer that, in my mind, is to think about the ways that humans aren't the center of the natural world, and how can things exist in so many multiplicities and complexities that just really don't map onto how we behave or exist, essentially. So yeah, in terms of fungi, that's like, it's such an, in my mind, such an easy sort of parallel to draw, because fungi do their own thing like 100%. And I think that's part of the reason why for so long, as I kind of mentioned before, like the colonial botanist, I think literally would have been like stressed out by fungi. I kind of really enjoy that, actually, the idea that like quite a lot of European botanists will have, gone on these horrible expeditions across the world to the different colonies, particularly of the British Empire, and kind of, been like, what the hell are these fungi? And like, they didn't fit into any of the sort of behaviors that, for example, maybe plants do or animals in other respects do. And therefore, fungi were really kind of denounced as being like a lesser life form, which is kind of, to be honest, like how queer people are viewed in a lot of ways, and particularly in the current climate, trans people, because it's like, you don't fit. I don't understand you. What are you? Are you a man or a woman? Are you a this or a that? And there's a real sort of culture war in a way of trying to label things in a really clear-cut, defined, put you in this box, and therefore I understand you, and I can therefore kind of situate you in the world. So yeah, I get a lot of sort of enjoyment from the fact that fungi do really defy a lot of the kind of norms and expectations and binaries that exist in our world, particularly around, if we're to think about it in a very literal sense, fungi don't really have typical biological sexes. Like they can have, there's a kind of fungus that's called a split gill, which has more than 23,000 ways of mating. So it's really not a case of just like, this is a male and this is a female, they can mate. It's very much just like, okay, your type, this is one type, and then there's type 2, and going all the way up to 23,000 sort of types of sex. So yeah, it's really helps me to kind of like open up my mind to the fact that we're not the only way of existing in the world, which I find really refreshing. And yeah, sometimes just makes me chuckle to myself.
It's really powerful what you're saying, how this sort of colonial, very anthropocentric quest to know and to understand in order to feel like you're in control, right? Like it's this pattern throughout history. And I think the fact that we can now bring that to today and to see it through something living outside of boxes and seeing that happening in the world of fungi, I think is such a almost sort of disruptive lens to look through and analyze human life and human ways of living. So
I hope so. Yeah. And I do, again, really think that's kind of testament more to fungi than like my work, for example, just because, really, it does feel like fungi are like the original disruptors in many ways. Even in my own kind of personal learning, there'll be so many moments where I think I know a certain fungi like really well, and then we'll see it doing something completely different to what I expected. And it's kind of just like, like you said, holding that sort of transience and permanent way of being, and thinking about how that can allow us to also shift and kind of transmute in these interesting ways. Yeah, it's quite liberating, I think.
Now, I gave you some preparation for this question, but I can ask you to read the poem Chameleon with a Shaggy Imp Cap that I believe you were commissioned to write and perform at an event organised by Goldsmiths University in London.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it was quite a few years ago, so it's really nice to come back to that piece. And just to give a little bit of like context for it, one of my favorite mushrooms, particularly at the time I wrote this, is called a shaggy ink cap, which is a type of mushroom. They're really amazing. So Yeah, they have this kind of grayish brown cap and a white stem and kind of a traditional mushroom shape. So you wouldn't expect anything particularly unusual necessarily. That's an ink cap more broadly. And then a shaggy ink cap is more, as the name suggests, it's kind of got like almost scales on it and it looks almost a little bit fluffy. And they're kind of quite tall and thin when they start to grow and then open out to a more open cap. And basically the thing that I really loved about them, ink caps in general, but particularly shaggy ink caps, is they have this amazing way of decomposing that allows them to turn into a liquid, like a black liquid, which is why they have been called an ink cap, because that can be used as a literal ink. And that's how they release their spores. So the reason that I loved them so much and decided to write a bit of a poem around it was because I was thinking about how they produce this amazing, beautiful structure only to then decompose themselves. And yeah, I just thought that was like a really interesting way of kind of existing. So yeah, I'll read my poem, which is called Communion with the Shaggy Ink Cap. In our new reality, that shared space which we constructed, you and I together, I wonder how it feels to be alive. All is dirt, the ground has swallowed us, and yet we are cocooned. Our exteriors are soft like terracotta clay. In this place, we are connected by hand-woven threads, marrying palm to palm in giant nestling webs of care. Our support extends through branched arms like puppeteers of the night sky, stretching through the soil and into the farthest corners of this Lalmati, red earth. There are no borders anymore. We decomposed them into thick black molasses and drank the syrup of their deliquescence. As wildfires ravaged and forest floors wept, still, crimson flickers danced in their dilated pupils, until one day we awoke and they were no more. Since we replaced them, we weave kind multiplicities, fibers joining intricately, digesting mindfully, cycling through so many lives and so many deaths, every day reminding ourselves that nourishment can be found even in the loneliest of places, a kind of scarcity turned abundant. Sometimes when my spirit is heavy, I sing an affirmation, whispering through the darkness. I am mycelium, you are hyphae, and we are a vegetative body.
Thank you so much for reading that. It gave me goosebumps the first time I read it, and it's given me goosebumps again listening to you.
Thank you.
I find it really moving. And actually, when I first read it, I was thinking through kind of all the things that were coming into my head, and it really hit me, this idea of how fungi and soils together can create life out of death, which has been said many times before, but I think it's almost like this alchemy, if you think about it, that life and sort of life in the ground as being wildly diverse and mutualistic, even symbiotic, and other times, obviously, it can be brutal and quite insurgent and subversive and surprising. But I also took from it that there's many lessons from ecosystems as how to live, how to grow, how to distribute resources, to make relations and seek strength and persist. And so I wondered, going back to something you said earlier as well, about how there's rage in this world and how there's grief and fatigue and survival and endless struggle. And I wondered how you see the practice, so that is to say moving beyond the realm, I guess, of imagining, of fungi-inspired radical futures, like how maybe in your own community you've seen the influence of ecosystems have impact in how we can commune, I guess, together.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful question. I think, yeah, it's a really beautiful and quite challenging question, because I feel like it's such a horrible world that we're living in right now, to be completely frank. And I think the reasons that I feel like fungi can really inspire different radical futures is because of this exact metaphor that you've kind of named, and the poem was speaking to as well, which was around how do you break things down and decompose things that aren't currently serving us. And not only that, but like, what do you do in the ruins of that? How do you rebuild? And I think, yeah, it's something that I really repeatedly come back to as a sort of practice, and particularly as someone who for a long time has been interested in and identify as an abolitionist, which is, yeah, this idea of borders, policing, prisons, the military industrial complex, all of these different systems of oppression, and how do we replace them, and what do we replace them with? Because we are all of an understanding at some point that there's no way to kind of reform. It just needs to be transformation that's happening, and transformative justice is definitely, yeah, something that I'm really committed to. And I think fungi, yeah, lend themselves very naturally to that. So that kind of thinking that I've had for a long time as an activist, kind of since I was a teenager, so for a really long time now, just kind of quite neatly meshes onto the behaviors and kind of acts of care that fungi are already and have been doing so for such a long time. So yeah, I do often have these kind of practices in myself and with the project with Fungi Futures of really meditating with and reflecting quite deeply on how do we get out of the sort of mess that we're in. And I sometimes I kind of hesitated to say the mess that we've created, because then I think that takes on responsibility for a lot of humanity that we're not a part of in many ways. And I definitely feel like, as a person of color as well, that, yeah, so much of the damage has been done through colonization, which isn't, yeah, anything to do with me. And the same goes for like corporations who've got us into a lot of the ecological crises that we're seeing, multi crises. So I think, yeah, there's a big sort of reflective element of the work that I do. And even though, as I said before, I guess I don't have the answers, I do really feel like taking these moments of pause to really think about and learn from, and kind of almost somaticize some of the teachings of fungi, particularly around decomposition and the sort of creativity and ingenuity that they inspire from literally the sort of ruins of things, and creating and rebuilding life, like you said, gives me a bit of hope. And I think definitely, yeah, it's really lovely to be able to kind of offer that way of thinking and approach to others and community, and kind of try and put our heads together and our hearts together to kind of figure out figure out what those futures can look like together. So I guess a lot of the time I'm also really aware that it's not just my future. I don't want to be the one that's kind of like making those decisions in a way. And it needs to be a future that's led by the people who are most multiply sort of marginalized and oppressed by the systems we're currently living in. So yeah, I don't think that necessarily is always going to be me. And I think, yeah, it's important that we have a lot of spaces for people to heal, basically, and design and co-create those futures together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really powerful. And what you said about putting heads and hearts together, it made me think about as well some of the work that you did a while ago with the group Peaks of Colour. And so I was thinking, sort of bringing, I guess, the lens and the focus onto the UK context, and thinking about capitalism and colonialism having torn many people from the land, particularly Black and people of colour. And though there are more and more groups seeking to diversify the outdoors, quote, the outdoors is a term that I'm not really a fan of. I don't really know how to make sense of this term, but anyway, there are others that are working to decolonize it. And so I wondered, with your experience having worked with Peaks of Colour, I know you did a workshop, which is different to a workshop, called Imagining Fugitive Futures. Is that correct?
That's right.
And so I wondered, because I think this speaks to how you feel that maybe systems of enclosure and lack of access to land might influence your work and ability to guide people outside and create interspecies relationships, because I'm sure that's an obstacle that you must hit against a lot.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, thanks so much for making it such a specific question to the UK, because I do think it's sometimes, and I find myself doing this too, like easy to fall into a trap of kind of talking about land and access and nature in quite general terms. And I do think we have like a really specific history in the UK and a really, particular dynamics around land ownership and the history of enclosures and all of this kind of stuff and the Right to Roam campaign. And it's important to sometimes like actually ground in our kind of specific context. I think definitely it's important to kind of remember that in the UK, the vast majority of land is privately owned. I think I can't remember the exact statistic, but I think it's like over 90% of green spaces and land is privately owned still, which I think really surprises people, because there are obviously, compared to other cities, especially in London where I'm based, like there is access to some great public green spaces. But I think it is definitely very different to actually have access to a piece of land in a sort of more permanent way. And it's something that I think about a lot in terms of like, in my work, I often hold walks and workshops, as you said, specifically for Black people and people of color, given exactly what you mentioned of our particular histories of colonization and being ripped away from our original homelands, and also the kind of continuing climate in the UK of then not only being the continuing legacy of colonization, kind of neo-colonialism, of not only having been ripped away from our lands, but then the attitudes towards migration and the very literal policies that are causing people to drown trying to get to the UK. So it's really kind of like this broad political framing that I think is really, really important when we come to conversations around land, because it's not like hypothetical. It's very much like a lived reality that people are not able to access land and build relationship to the land that they were from. And that continues to be the case. So I think it's something that's always going to be a priority for me to kind of continue to, even though I have, again, a lower privilege of being a citizen in Britain. I've built a relationship with this particular piece of land since I was born, which is again a particular like set of privilege. But I think, at least on a personal level, that means it's even more important for me to try and broaden out the access to the land that we have here. So a lot of the time that looks like doing walks with refugee migrant groups and asylum seekers. And one thing that I have really learned through doing that, and again, this is because of my own privilege, because I feel a sense of like feeling really welcome in particular green spaces, especially in the city, maybe less so in the rural sort of countryside. Definitely I don't feel that sense of safety at all in the countryside. But I do, generally speaking, feel very comfortable, like I described in my childhood, of growing up a lot of the time outside and feeling like I could just go to a park and climb a tree. But a lot of the time when I work with groups who don't have that same experience and have migrated, they're often the cases that I'll maybe go on a walk somewhere, like a really beautiful public space, and a lot, like almost every time people are like, oh, we can come here, like this is okay for us, like we're allowed, kind of thing. Like really, it's like groundbreaking, because it's kind of just like, oh, this is around the corner and I can also come to this park, or I can also forage from this this patch, or wherever it is. And I think that's definitely something that I've kind of been reflecting on a lot, of how do we actually accept our own levels of privilege and then expand the sort of sense of belonging to particular places of land. Because it's made me feel quite horrible in certain contexts of like, of course you can, like this is no more my park than it is yours, and I think it's something that I really am committed to trying to change.
Yeah, you've raised some really important points, especially thinking about how, in the context of the right to roam movement in the UK, how often it feels like it's something very, we have to have rights to large open spaces, and that until we achieve that, it's not enough. But actually, you don't have to look far at all to understand how absurd, how cruel, and how oppressive these land lines that have been drawn are, because from what you just described, and extending it out obviously to what you were sharing with us about you not feeling safe in rural places, is something it's just unacceptable, and also something that I think it really does need to be featured more into the broader movement of the Right to Roam campaign. I thought maybe actually this segues quite appropriately into my last question for you, which is, within the world of nature guiding and also herbal medicine and foraging and plant identification and nature-based art, there are many practices that have origins within them that are not always acknowledged, or they're not always understood or respected by their practitioners. And I think I've seen this quite a lot within the foraging context. So I feel like it's being made more accessible by social media, thanks to the sort of the influence kind of caricature, I guess you could describe it. But I wondered how you feel maybe about, there's perhaps a lack of what is called an honourable harvest. Honourable harvest is just a concept used by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's scientist and an amazing author. And I feel like it's leading to like maybe a risk around the consumption of nature, of kind of taking and not thinking about what might be done to intentionally replenish or repair as we walk through nature. And so I wonder what thoughts you had on this, and in particular a topic that I know that you've done work on, which is cyanotyping, which is a form of art, and that it's also very much connected to ecologies. But this artistic method has a colonial history that I know that you've done workshops on, and around decolonial cyanotyping. Would you like to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I absolutely love the process of cyanotyping. I've been doing it since I was a teenager, but it was just really interesting. And maybe interesting is the wrong word. It was quite horrifying to realize some of the history of cyanotyping, because it's something that I've been doing for such a long time, and I've built such a like loving relationship with, as like I'm sure like an A-level art student or something. Like it goes really far back. And then I just had a suspicion, because photography has such a colonial history, and I did a lot of film photography at a certain age as well. So I kind of had this niggling thought of, I really need to kind of research and unpack this method as much as I can. And it was very difficult to do, because cyanotyping was, I guess, originally kind of the technique was done by Anna Atkins, who was a Victorian woman. And because she was a woman, it was very much seen as it's always kind of, how do I even explain it? But I guess it's always really packaged as something that's quite revolutionary, because a woman did it. And so much of photography and kind of art making in that way, is particularly because it wasn't kind of a craft, it was seen as like a way of recording. And photography, it's very much painted as, a female pioneer did this. And I was kind of really interested in the fact that, as a white Victorian woman in England, what was her relationship to British colonialism, which, as I'm sure you're aware, like Victorian era was a huge time in terms of the British Empire. And yeah, unfortunately, the kind of once I really dug deep into it, it does seem as though a lot of the reason that Anna Atkins was able to spend time in leisure kind of recording in this way by doing sonotypes, which I should explain are kind of like prints that you can do of plants and of any kind of still object, but she was doing them predominantly of plants using the sun to record. So it's kind of often known as solar printing, to record the negatives, and you get these beautiful blue prints with the white negative. And she did these often in her leisure, but the reason that she could, and a lot of the time the plants that she was recording in this way were from the colonies, and it's very difficult to understand exactly how she got them. And it's probably because, actually not probably, I remember reading into her relationship with her husband, who was definitely putting a lot of money into colonies and potentially slave ownership, so plantations, and that's where a lot of that wealth came from. And also that's how she was accessing plants that were from across the world. So it was just an interesting sort of journey for me to learn about and then contextualize. And in my workshops, I really try to kind of explain and teach the context that I've researched myself, and then not only do that, but also kind of think around how can we use this technique, but kind of within that context, trying to do it in a kind of, subvertive way. And the way that I like to do that is by kind of really not prioritizing kind of just the names, the botanical names of the plants, and kind of doing it in a very categorizing way of recording, which is the colonial method of botany, but rather to kind of take a lot of time and care to build relationships to the plants that we're recording. And then this can just be a supplementary way of really of kind of capturing some of that relationship through, and kind of almost like creating a bit of like a token of our love for the plants that we capture. So it's been really beautiful to kind of open up those spaces and think about a sort of traditional technique in such a different way.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I am familiar with the practice of cyanotyping, but I had absolutely no idea until I encountered your work around this that it had that history. I guess it speaks to the fact that there are many forms of artistic expression that I engage with, and I'm sure many people engage with, that don't think to inquire into the historical origins of those practices. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, and hopefully educating many other people around this, and maybe people that don't even know what cyanotyping is, and now they might be more aware of it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I definitely really love to still practice it, like I said, because I'm literally got a cyanotype that I'm looking at right now next to me. And I think that sometimes the fear around I mean, I hope listeners to this sort of podcast wouldn't be fearful of the idea of decolonizing, but I think sometimes people really think that decolonizing just means we kind of throw everything away that has any like relationship with colonialism. And sometimes that is the correct response, for sure, if it's something that just holds too much violence to really be contextualized in any sort of meaningful way, then we just do away with it is better. But I am really interested in kind of finding ways to disrupt and repurpose, and find through creative means ways of like expressing and understanding these sometimes like very emotionally difficult and loaded topics like colonialism. So it's definitely an ongoing sort of practice of mine to try and do that. But I think decolonizing is something that's definitely needs to be more practice led rather than just kind of academic theory, which get quite bored of quite quickly. We need to be doing the thing rather than just talking about it.
Absolutely. Okay, I am aware of the time, so I'm going to try and wrap it up. I'm going to quote you now. I heard you doing a talk at, I think it was called the Garden Museum of Garden. And
Yeah, the Garden Museum,
yeah, and you used a phrase which I absolutely loved, and I thought I'd have to say out loud, which is to weave and connect in a giant superorganism living tapestry. And I thought, wow, like so many ideas and imagery coming into my head with that. But yeah, I just wondered if we could end it, I guess, on that note. Any groups or people that you feel particularly influential in helping to build that tapestry?
Wow, that's a really beautiful question. I feel like definitely there are so many groups that are, doing really, really important work. One of them that comes to mind immediately is Land in Our Names, which, is a BIPOC collective that does a lot of, really interesting work around reparations and land ownership in the UK. So we'd definitely recommend them. Also, Misery, which is a collective that I work with that's for queer and trans Black people and people of color, and a mental health collective. And the program that I run with that, which I just have found so much abundance in, is called Misery Medicine, which is a nature gathering and plant fungi inspired space. So definitely would recommend both of those. And definitely also just please feel free to, if people are new to this, to my project, like I'm always looking for people to kind of collaborate with and bring into spaces of like walks and workshops and all of that kind of thing. So hopefully we can work together to make that living tapestry.
You've been listening to an episode of the Future Natures podcast. We've been talking to Maymana Arefin, the founder of the Fungi Futures project. To learn more about this project, please check out the show notes or follow them on Instagram under the name @fungi.futures. There are links to the many references made in this conversation in the show notes, where you can also find out how to subscribe to the Future Natures newsletter so you can keep up with future episodes. If you have any ideas for future guests for our episodes, please do reach out to us via our website. Until next time.